Howdy. Texas is a strange place, and I don't just mean the people. When I was walking here this morning, I noticed the manhole covers, they're made out of iron, but they're labeled Austin concrete. That's a fact. And what's this thing they call barbed wire that they put between cattle pens? But you know, I'm also a little bit strange. You may have noticed that. So I'd like to warn you in advance, this talk is going to be strange. I mean, stranger than normal. Or in my case, stranger than abnormal. Many of you know that I was diagnosed with prostate cancer earlier this year. And this has had several interesting results. Being diagnosed with cancer, first of all, means that you get very distracted. I mean, very, very distracted. More distracted than I'm normally distracted. Oh, look. Then they operate on you, and the general anesthesia makes you loopy for months after that. Well, it makes me loopy. Not to mention the pain meds, or the pain. And then you get invited to conferences like this one to give a rousing speech of the swan song variety, where you are expected to pour out your deepest passions and hopes, inspiring the community to carry on the torch for you long after you've ridden into the sunset. You know, one more for the old Gipper and all that. Well, that's fiction. Here's how the story really goes. What really happens is that due to your mental fog and general lack of energy, you put off writing your talk to the last moment, come up with a harebrained idea, and you end up rambling on about strange things that leave everyone scratching their heads. But that's okay, because the best part is that everyone has to put up with you because they feel sorry for you. Oh. Well, don't. I mean, don't feel sorry for me. You still have to put up with me. Feel sorry for yourselves. So, the title is what it is. Matthew asked me for a title for this talk, and I just nonchalantly threw out Stranger Than Fact, not knowing whether it was a good title or whether it even meant anything at all. But it sounded pretty cool, since we already know that fact is stranger than fiction, and we all know that I like to talk about strange things. So let's go with it and try to see if there's anything stranger than fact. For various reasons, I've been thinking a lot about numbers recently. When you design a computer language, you have to think a lot about numbers. When you get cancer, you also have to think a lot about numbers. I'd like to think that computer languages and cancer are unrelated, but you never know, you know? Now, numbers aren't exactly facts, and they aren't exactly fictions. They just sort of are. Numbers are mysterious in that existential sense, in much the same way that the entire universe is mysterious in an existential sense. Higher math is even more mysterious than numbers. Well, math that is higher than me is more mysterious to me, at any rate. And of course, there are those continual arguments among the philosophers about whether higher math is discovered or invented. One of our more famous irrationalities is that we like to pretend that something we invented was really just discovered. See Tolkien. I've sometimes wondered whether the universe is actually made out of math, whatever that means. I'm good at hand waving. You guys make it mean something. Wait, we're in Texas. All y'all can make it mean something. But beyond the universe being made out of math, I've also wondered from time to time whether God is made out of higher math that just happened to notice itself through some Gödelian self-referential trick and proceed to develop a personality. You may think that's far-fetched. And I've probably offended both the theists and the atheists by now. But I'm trying to get you guys to stop compartmentalizing, which is another way we're irrational. So let's approach this idea from a different direction. Many of us in computer science seem to be pretty willing to believe that our computers might be self-aware someday, or at least sentient in some sense. Or we believe that after the singularity, we might be able to download our personalities into a machine and live on forever. Well, probably not forever, but at least until somebody pulls the plug and then discovers that some superbacterium has eaten all the backup tapes. So how is it that we can believe that our future computers will be that smart, but somehow we can't see that the universe is a very big computer that is already quite conducive to various simulations of intelligence, yours and mine among them, and to a lesser extent, my cat's, a much lesser extent in that case. There are various levels of sentience and self-awareness just on this earth, and they're already strange enough, but the whole universe is already stranger than fact in its way, insofar as facts have to have happened already, and much of the universe hasn't happened yet. Through quantum fluctuations, our universe is continually making up new facts, or our multiverse, or whatever kind of verse it is. Personally, I kind of like the holographic theory of our universe. The holographic theory says that our perceived dimensions are really projections onto a holographic hypersphere somewhere else, where, who knows, that's where the physicists start waving their hands. Physicists are strange too, especially theoretical physicists. I'm allowed to say that because my son Aaron does black hole quantum thermodynamics for a living, and for the fun of it. He likes the holographic universe because it makes some kind of sense, some kind of the math, the math is prettier somehow. Don't ask me to explain. But I like the holographic projection theory because it makes me feel a little bit like A square living in Flatland. But maybe I'm just projecting. No pun intended. You know, I really shouldn't lie about that, should I? Not when I'm considering my mortality and all. Anyway, I rather like the idea that someone is watching our story on the big holographic screen, someone who is maybe not constrained by the speed of light, as we are. I like the idea, but maybe you don't like the idea of being watched. I kind of like being the center of attention. You may have noticed that. But it doesn't really matter whether we like it or not. Whether it's actually so or not has nothing to do with whether we like it. The universe gets to make up its own mind on how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and we just have to cope. And yet, despite the fact that our universe seems to be conducive to various simulations of intelligence, we somehow can't imagine that the universe contains any higher life forms of such advancement that we, as mere earthlings, might classify them as divine. And when we do imagine it, we generally just create gods in our own image. I'm reminded of the Apollo episode in the original Star Trek series for some reason. That Apollo was kind of a sorry excuse for a higher life form, though. Well, really, all of the Greek gods were kind of sorry excuses for higher life forms. Most of our gods this day are still sorry excuses for higher life forms. Anyway, I don't know about you, but it seems quite likely to me that there could be higher life forms out there in our universe, and maybe even some life forms outside our very universe bubble, which could nonetheless be watching the holograph of our universe with great interest. Now, why is a good question. Maybe it's just a little boring to be made out of higher math. I don't know. We're kind of a soap opera, except that we're factual. Well, maybe we're factual. We're stranger than fiction anyway, that's what they say. And maybe we're stranger than fact. We're all definitely pretty strange, especially Perl people. But we're not only stranger than we imagine, we're stranger than we can imagine. It comes with living in this universe, which is the same way. But leaving theology out of it and going back to those numbers, we still don't even understand the integers, let alone all the other kinds of numbers, rational, irrational, or transcendental. So if numbers are neither fact nor fiction, I'd like to think that numbers are one example of things that are stranger than fact. As I say, I've been thinking a lot about numbers lately. After they found a lump in my prostate earlier this year, they did a biopsy and discovered prostate cancer. It's not stranger than fact, it's just a normal fact. A very personal fact, but a fact nonetheless. Of course, one can exercise a great deal of irrationality around such a fact, but I prefer not to. Ah! Now, those of you who have done the cancer thing know that doctors like to use numbers to explain what they know and what they don't know. In my case, my biopsy gave me a rating of 3+4, which means that most of the cancer they found is medium bad, but some of it was worse than that. My doctor says things like, if both numbers are 3, I can cure it 90% of the time with surgery. If both numbers are 4, I can cure it 50% of the time. He also says he's done 1,000 of these operations, so he should know. So I went home with some books he lent me and figured out from the books that, given the biopsy results, I had a 40% chance it had spread to the other side of my prostate and about a 14% chance that there was an extra prostatic extension, as they call it. It means it's kind of leaking out. And about a 2% chance that it had spread further than that, which more or less comes out to, we'll know a lot more when we take it out. I didn't really know what to think, so like any rational person, I chalked up my chances as 50-50 and scheduled the surgery. And so I had my prostate removed a couple months ago. I will spare you the details, except for some other interesting numbers. I was operated on by a robot with 5 arms. Its name was Clyde. You know I had to ask. They said Bonnie was over in the corner. I think it was the workstation the doctor used to control the robot, but I was already strapped down and couldn't see it. Her, whatever. More numbers. Humans are supposed to be objects of genus 3. That's what a topologist would say. You know, a topologist is someone who can't tell a donut from a coffee cup because they both have one hole that goes all the way through, and you could deform the one into the other. Always presuming the coffee cup didn't shatter first or that the donut didn't dissolve from the coffee you poured into it. Topologists are strange too. Anyway, human beings, at least those with intact eardrums, are supposed to have 3 topologic holes, hence genus 3. No, I'm not going to describe all the holes for you. But my point is that for a while there, thanks to Clyde the robot, I was all the way up to a genus 8 object. That broke my previous record of 5. In other words, I had a lot of holes. You might even say I was holier than thou. Though maybe not as holy as Bonnie and Clyde ended up. Anyway, after the surgery, Gloria and I were kind of hoping for a straight thumbs up or thumbs down from the results. But the news from the pathologist was again kind of mixed. The cancer was a little more aggressive than they thought and was now rated not just as a 3-4, but as a 3-4-5. It had, in fact, spread to the other side of the prostate and had also been trying to find a way out. That extra prostatic extension thing that I was only supposed to have a 14% chance of. So that was some of the bad news. On the good side, it looked like they might have got it all anyway. The lymph nodes were clear, the surgical margins were clear, though one of them was clear only by 0.1 millimeter. That's a scary number. Though I suppose you can actually fit a lot of good cells into 0.1 millimeters. On the bad side, when cancer metastasizes, it can bypass all that and go anywhere in your body. But even though I hit that 14% jackpot, chances are I haven't hit that 2% jackpot. We can find out though. That's because the other bit of good news is that they have a really good test to see if they got it all. Since prostate-specific antigen is made only by the prostate, that's what prostate-specific means after all, duh. And I don't have one of those anymore. The PSA readings should go all the way down to 0 if all is well. So in this case, 0 is a very good number to get on a test. The bad news is that it takes 3 months for the PSA level to drop down to 0. So I won't know my prognosis till mid-July. If the PSA is 0, great. If not, well, then there are many other things to try, depending. So here I am standing in front of you, not knowing whether I'll live or die. Well, okay, technically I know I'll die, just not when. We all have to go sooner or later. And really, it might not matter if we take that whole bus number thing literally. In fact, I almost did once. I felt really stupid a couple of years ago when I very nearly did step out in front of a bus. It's always possible I'm stupid enough to try it again. In fact, since I'm stupider now than I was then, it probably makes it even likelier. Anyway, more numbers. In my mind, it's back to a 50-50 proposition. Or maybe not. I called my daughter Heidi, who is sort of the philosopher of the family. She has a son, Julian, which makes Julian my grandson. Some of you know that Julian recently completed 3 years of treatment for leukemia, and he's doing very well so far. It's quite likely that he is cured. Yay! Anyway. Heidi has thought deeply about these cancery, numbery things, you can bet. So I told her my news, and I mentioned that even though the doctor thought my odds now roughly 75%, in my mind I still had my odds pegged at 50-50. There was a pause, and then Heidi said, "No, Dad, it's not really 50-50. It's either 100-0 or it's 0-100. You just don't happen to know which one of those it is yet." Oh, yeah, I guess. Leave it to your kids to teach you the finer points of Bayesian statistics. Well, leave it to my kids anyway. They're all strange. Wonder where they get it from. You try to raise your kids to be smart, but mostly they just end up smart-mouthed. It's genetic. But I love them irrationally. It seems like a good thing in this case. Most of our personal relationships are of necessity based on irrational motivations. This cuts both ways. We love irrationally and we hate irrationally. Both fact and fiction bear testimony to this. But we're all a little bit irrational about a lot of things all the time. Psychologists are discovering that our brains are full of tricksy little rules of thumb that work most of the time. We cheat and cut corners all the time and don't really notice because our brains are also really good at lying to themselves and making up a story after the fact that seems rational, or at least plausible enough to pass cursory inspection. But this is basically who we are as a species. We want to think of ourselves as rational, but irrationality is the unavoidable heritage from our upbringing as a species over the last few million years. Irrationality is what enlivens our dreams and our fears and our imaginations. It's what makes our human potential stranger than either fact or fiction. Irrationality is our gift of chaos, to be managed wisely or foolishly. So enough of this philosophical hand-waving too, yeah. How does this relate to Perl and to Perl culture? Let's take the language first. How do we manage our irrationality in the design of a computer language? Where can our language help us out when our minds play tricks on us? Turns out there are several places where Perl helps us out. Many of these, of course, have to do with the good old laziness, impatience, and hubris. But those often come down to the limitations of our working memory. We can only hold so many things in our head at once, 7 plus or minus 2, so we try to avoid stuffing things in that will force other things out. The modern formulation of this is, of course, TLDR. Too long, didn't read. Of course, any form of abstraction is a way to avoid thinking things that are too long to keep in your head. Most computer languages support naming things like functions and classes so that you can forget about their innards. Perl has enough syntactic flexibility to let you hide the boring bits of your program in plain sight. Perl lets you format your code so that important things are along the left margin and relegate the boring code off to the right. Another TLDR thing is the ability to suppress clutter, which people often find distracting, especially if they are susceptible. Perl 5 reduced some of the clutter from Perl 4, and Perl 6 has gone even further in that direction, such as by removing the need for parens on conditionals, and by making dereferencing work left to right without all those extra curlies that Perl 5 often requires. And I'm sure you all know that some people who reject Perl simply because of an irrational dislike for sigils. So in Perl 6, we even allow a sigilless style of programming to cater to those people. Now, I don't expect everyone to program that way. I do fully expect them to lose their distaste for sigils once they start using Perl, but by removing that as an excuse, we diffuse and work around those irrational feelings that keep them from even getting started in the first place. Another feature you probably don't think much about is something we call precedence dropping. If you wrote something like this, you would think it very strange, and so would the Perl parser. And yet, we do essentially the same thing with every list operator. In terms of precedence, a list operator parses as an opening parenthesis without a closing parenthesis. Excuse me. Now, if you want, you can write that like that, but in that case, you have to remember to look for the parenthesis at the end. Parenthesis droppers allow you to keep more important things in your working memory because they tickle that TLDR neuron that just the way that neuron likes to be tickled. You may have also heard about this principle as the end weight problem, which caused people to put the heavy things later in their sentence. Kind of a linguistic concept. As it turns out, Perl 6 has a lot more precedence droppers than Perl 5 even. This includes things like the phaser block, which can now take bare statements in Perl 6. In Perl 5, you say begin block. You just put it on a statement. It can introduce a statement. And what this convenient little thing says, it calculates the elapsed time between when the statement was compiled and now. which might be months. The old do block can also drop its brackets and put a statement after it, so it drops precedence down to a statement level. So you can do tricks like this. Not that you necessarily write it that way, you probably use the ternary operator. In fact, since you should never put in a feature without driving it into the ground, Perl 6 has a bunch of these statement prefixes. With a colon, you can also make method calls into precedence droppers that behave like list operators. So the colon after the push there says, oh, there's arguments here, parse it as an argument list. And like a list operator, the precedence is different on either side of it. Precedence was introduced in the first place to reduce clutter. It's pretty amazing how often the precedence table matches our expectations, but this points out another psychological quirk. We all kind of expect the computer to read our minds. Even the experts. We're always just a little bit shocked when the computer parses our expression the wrong way. And this often means we want the precedence table to be able to make contradictory decisions, and it just can't. We've done a lot of work in Perl 6 revising the precedence table, but there are still places that fool the experts frequently, mostly when we want methods to be both tighter and looser than prefix operators. If you say this, it actually does the pick method before it does the up to prefix operator. So you think you were asking it to say, okay, from the numbers 0 through 9, pick one of them. But in fact, you're picking 10 and then returning the range up to that, so it doesn't do what you expect. You really have to write this. Well, say, well, okay, well, but we just, change it to be precedence the other way. But, when you write something like this, object.x, you're pulling out an attribute of the object, and that's like a variable. And then you want to negate it. So that is really working like that. So you want it both ways. We know what we meant, but why can't the computer read our minds, darn it? Another way we go wrong is by overgeneralizing. In the interests of conserving our brain memory space, we often figure out generalizations, but sometimes those are overgeneralizations. When we do this to people, we refer to it as stereotyping, but the same process happens in programming. Here, you notice they left out the colon on the push, and that's really a 2 terms in a row error, because methods default to not taking arguments unless you actually put the colon or the parens. Now, Perl compensates for this particular idiosyncrasy by reminding you that you need parens or a colon to pass the arguments to a method. It actually just is smart about that. We also bank on the overgeneralizing tendency when we teach the language, when we say things like a method is just a subroutine, a class is just a package. We are greatly oversimplifying, but it taps into the same neurons that go, Mosik is just a Swede, so obviously he's a socialist. All Texans think that all Swedes are socialists. And of course, from that you can deduce that all Californians are liars. But that's overgeneralizing. But we can also make the mistake of undergeneralizing. Newbies often make the opposite mistake and undergeneralize what they've learned. But we can fix that culturally by allowing people to learn Perl little by little and not forcing them to learn a bunch of theory that they are not ready for. So for instance, we call this an anonymous subroutine, and we don't have to explain immediately that closures are quite a bit more powerful than simply code references. Later, when they're ready to learn it, we teach them what closure means. Sometimes people undergeneralize because of their background. You've all seen the kind of code that reads like assembly language. It has not yet occurred to these folks that print takes a list of arguments that will automatically be glued together. Perl 5 programmers who start with Perl 6 often don't realize that the first argument to a grep is much more powerful than just a regular expression or a block. Smart matching is ubiquitous throughout Perl 6, and you could do things like match against the type. Or you can say, pick out anything that matches 2, 3, 5, or 7 out of this list. But these are things that they can learn as they go. We all look back on some of the code we wrote long ago and shudder at how we used the program. It's nothing to be ashamed of, really. Another thing we use that's psychological is the notion of shouting. Or if you're doing Takahashi method, we make it even bigger. People don't like to be shouted at, so we use uppercase to simulate that. We want the programmer to feel a bit uncomfortable because something unusual or dangerous is going on. This includes phasers that introduce strange control flow. Or in Perl 6, so we always drive everything into the ground, we have many phasers. We also use this for dangerous pragmas. So if you want to program like in Ruby and change your integer class, then you have to declare that you're doing monkey typing in advance, and it's uppercase. Perhaps the biggest irrational itch that people have is simply that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. We cater to that by providing lots of ways to extend Perl. And we're getting a little better at that in Perl 6 because we've understood a few of the ways in which Perl 5's extension mechanisms are insane. You all know about the problem with source filters, which is that they lose track of exactly which language they're parsing. So you can't stack them. But this problem occurs on many levels, both within the Perl 5 lexer and in user code. Because we overgeneralize our languages into text. For instance, we've all probably written code that does a series of substitutions like that. But what's really happening here is that each substitution is mutating into a slightly different language. And things get messy very quickly because you're taking multiple passes on the same text and they interact in unforeseen ways. So in Perl 6, we have grammars to keep our languages straight so that they can parse in a single pass so that we can know exactly which language we're parsing at each point. And we eat our own dog food with the standard Perl parser because we can do much cleaner extensions with one-pass parsing than we could with text-based substitutions. So even if you don't like Perl 6 as it stands, it's pretty easy to derive a new language that's tweaked more to your liking because you're irrational. But then, ain't we all? Which brings us to the topic of community. Yesterday I asked Patrick where he thought Perl supports us in our irrationality. He said, well, just look at the results. Just look at all the strange modules people have produced. Look at all the strange people sitting here who feel free to be that way because Perl culture encourages people to be creative. I couldn't argue with that. We encourage people to dream, to do cargo cult programming, to find emotional gratification in programming, to gamble and make mistakes, to let 1,000 flowers bloom, etc., etc. We tell them there's more than one way to do it and make them believe it's usually a good thing to have that kind of freedom. There's a strange psychological trick there insofar as we give the users as much flexibility as possible, and then we discourage them from exercising that flexibility by providing them with pre-existing solutions. In Perl 6, we take this idea even further by hiding a lot of the flexibility down where they won't be discovered before the user is ready for it. So there's only like one obvious way to do objects, until you know better. We really want Perl to be a language that you can learn as you go and ignore the bits you aren't ready for. We want it to be a language that scales itself both up and down to the abilities of the programmer. Not many languages have that as an explicit goal. In those languages, you can just learn how the language designer thinks from day one. We are irrationally committed to the concept that different programmers are allowed to think differently from each other. Now, how about the hard bits? None of us really wants to do the hard work of understanding other people. We all love to oversimplify. We have ways of oversimplifying our relationships. We ignore the big picture and zero in on the thing that's irritating us. We paint people white or black. And when all else fails, we take our marbles and go home. Another failure mode is that we treat everything as a life or death decision. Now, there are a few life or death decisions. I'm hoping that the 0.1 millimeter margin that I had was a life or death decision. Okay, here's a hard piece of irrationality. Suppose, just hypothetically, that a community tries to set some standards for behavior. The thinking goes, if you have an explicit code of conduct, this will make everyone behave better. It's all very well intended, and it's kind of a good thing, of course, but here's what really happens. The people outside the code of conduct take it as a challenge to their freedom, and the people inside take that as a challenge to their moral authority. Both sides end up more interested in fighting than in actually solving their cultural differences. So everyone who cares one way or the other ends up behaving worse than if there had been no rules at all. It's one of mankind's worst irrationalities. We actually love to fight. But many folks over the years have found various ways of hacking the culture. Hacking culture is great. I love it. You know, from 2,000 years ago. And of course, earlier today, we were, recommended that we follow Postal's law to be liberal in what you accept and careful about what you say. But, on this law and grace thing, it should be called Postal's grace, not Postal's law. And I'm not talking about cheap bumper sticker grace here. You've seen them. I'm a sinner, just forgiven. One sometimes gets the sneaking suspicion that they are more interested in sinning than in being forgiven. No, the notion of gracious love, called agape in Greek, actually derives from the ancient notion of what it means to be a good host. This is the sort of grace that is provided from a host to a guest wandering from the desert. Provided because the host is a good host, not necessarily because the guest is a good guest. Personally, I find it most difficult to be gracious to the naysayers. So here's one of my favorite sayings. It's dog Latin for "don't let the bastards wear you down." This is hard. There are two typical approaches. You can take the martial arts approach, as when they try to hit you, don't be there. Or you can take the other martial arts approach, is be stronger than them, so you wear them down instead of you. But there's also kind of a third approach, and that is have a large enough soul that it doesn't matter how much of you they grind away. Now, in addition to giving me a swelled head, you guys have always done a really good job of expanding my soul, that I have more to grind away, and I want to thank you. So, I guess I don't mind the naysayers so much these days. More accurately, I try not to mind them so much. Naysayers are just differently irrational for me. Some people can't be helped, so I try to ignore them. Some people can't either be helped or ignored, but I still have a choice there. I can choose whether to hurt them or to love them, or both. Often it has to be a little of both, tough love and all that. Just try to remember that our natural tendency is to want to hurt more than to love. It's dangerous if you start enjoying the tough part. It's just too easy to get negative when people around you are negative. Our natural tendency is to escalate, which causes others to escalate. It doesn't take a bridge engineer to realize that such feedback effects can be destructive. Just look at the many feuds in history that have long outlived their original grievances and propagate primarily by spreading hate memes. So please don't hate, and please don't teach other people to hate. You don't have to be a slave to the negativity of the world around you. Recognize it, rise above it. I'm not saying you have to become a martyr and enjoy the process. Well, I guess I kind of am saying that. Become a martyr and enjoy the process, but not too much. Just a little. But when you think about it, the whole Perl culture is built on the notion of vicarious suffering, of one person suffering on behalf of another. I originally took on myself the pain to write something and share it so that other people wouldn't have to. CPAN authors do the same thing. People who write documentation do the same. And blessed are the peacemakers. You know that the peacemakers often get shot in the crossfire. Our community has a number of peacemakers who are willing to suffer a little to damp things down when the springs get a little too springy, when the social bridge starts swaying a little too much in the wind. Please value these people, the dampers, the peacemakers. If you can, be one of them. It will hurt sometimes, but I believe it is worth it. But if you can't find it in your constitution to be a peacemaker, at least try to appreciate it when others take the effort to keep feuds from starting or from propagating. And yeah, some of you are just hotheads. We need people in our community who are also passionate. But please don't be offended when somebody suggests that you cool your head a little. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't poisonous people who are better off outside of our community. Some people are truly interested in causing harm to the community as a form of entertainment. Some cancers have to be removed. Some cancers can be treated with a little radiation. Some cancers heal themselves without our ever really being aware of them. And some cancers can be ignored because something else will kill you first, like a bus. But in terms of people in our community, There are a lot of marginal cases that are hard to judge. I'm proud of you guys as a community. You've often given marginal people the benefit of the doubt in the hopes that sanity would later prevail, or at least that benign insanity that our community is noted for would happen. In general, you, the Perl community, are very forgiving of mistakes. I mean, come on. Look at how many of my mistakes you're still putting up with. First, I designed a Perl that is way too sloppy, and you put up with that for 25 years. Then I designed a Perl that is way too ambitious, and you put up with that for what, almost 13 years now? Well, some of you put up with it. Some of you do much more than put up with it, and some of you do much less. It all averages out. But you're also good at forgiving other people's mistakes. There are people who have thought that they burned their bridges with the Perl community, wandered off into the wide world, only to come back later to discover that they can still fit in with us. And this is to your credit, not just for accepting them back. It is also very helpful that you did not reject them totally in the first place. I don't know why, but some people, when they want to leave, try very, very hard to burn their bridges behind them. But you know, we don't have to help them set fire to the bridge. So finally, what are the lessons I've learned from my cancer? I find that in the short term, I find that the short term is much more precious to me, but that I care more about the long term. Yeah, that's contradictory. Deal with it. I'm irrational. Whenever you're depressed by your circumstances, remember that your circumstances are just that, circumstances. Circumstances are, by definition, circum, meaning around where you're standing. Your stance is more important than your circumstance. If you know where you stand, then it's okay to live in doubt. At this point, I don't know whether I will live or die. I don't know whether Perl will succeed or fail in the long term. If I peg out early like Alexander the Great, I don't know whether you will destroy the community like Alexander's generals did, but that's okay. In the overall scheme of things, none of us has a long time on this earth, and we just have to play the hand we're dealt. None of us has the time to figure everything out. We are not called to live in perfect knowledge. We are not called to live in fear. We are merely called to live in love, to have dreams that are larger than fiction, larger than fact. How hard can it be? Thank you.